So Batman has some incredibly sadistic villains, right? There's obviously the Joker, most everybody's number one choice. There's Bane, depending on the circumstances. Riddler's very similar to Bane, that it depends on the circumstances. You got Birthday Boy from Batman Earth 1. But then you have Victor Zsasz. And this guy is the most sadistic and unsettling of every villain that Batman has. Because unlike someone like the Joker, who goes out and kills people for no other reason than the fact that he wants the attention of Batman, Victor Zsasz is far more twisted than that. So the introduction of his character came during the early 1990s when comic books as a whole were basically taking a turn for darker, more mature stories, and it was really coming off the heels of the late 1980s when you had Watchmen, Saga of the Swamp Thing, and The Dark Knight Returns. But because of the popularity of all these types of stories, DC wanted to launch a Batman title that complemented the existing stories in Batman and Detective Comics, but focused more on exploring the darker, more psychological side of Gotham. And so in 1992, DC launched Shadow of the Bat, which was written by Alan Grant and drawn by Norm Brayfogle. Now, it was in the first issue of this series that we're actually introduced to Victor Zsasz, whose name was actually inspired by the last name of a psychiatrist that Alan Grant saw in a library while visiting his girlfriend. Now, this would prove to actually be a fitting inspiration for the character because Victor Zsasz is deeply rooted in psychology and that he has this warped view that by killing his victims, he's essentially doing them a service by liberating them from the prison of their minds. But the first 4 issues of Batman, Shadow of the Bat, tell a story called The Last Arkham, which is a reference to Jeremiah Arkham, the nephew of Arkham Asylum's founder, who's basically taken over as warden. But one of the patients being housed in the asylum is simply introduced as Mr. Zsasz, and he's a serial killer with 47 confirmed victims, although it is believed that the actual number is far more than that. Now, Zsasz operates with a signature modus operandi of slitting the throats of his victims and then posing them as if they were still alive. And each time Zsasz kills another victim, he commemorates the kill by carving a tally mark into his own skin. But this story centers on Batman getting himself committed to Arkham Asylum to investigate a series of killings that seem to match Victor Zsasz's style perfectly. But since Zsasz is locked up in Arkham, it's assumed the killer's a copycat because there's no way that Zsasz could be doing any of this. Except he is, because once inside, Batman figures out that what's going on here is Victor Zsasz is sneaking out of Arkham through an escape route that he had learned of by bribing the builder of the asylum. And during his stints on the outside, Zsasz claims more victims, but always ends up returning to Arkham voluntarily. And so, of course, this story ends with Zsasz being recaptured after a battle in the sewers with Batman and Nightwing, seemingly held in Arkham Asylum for what's supposed to be the rest of his life. And that's all we really knew about Zsasz for a few years, until Batman Chronicles number 3 in 1996, which gave us his pre-New 52 origin. Now, Alan Grant did return to write the origin of Victor, but this whole origin is revealed in a conversation between Zsasz, who's still being held in Arkham Asylum, and a psychiatrist. And Zsasz explains that his desire to kill does not come from any sort of deficiency in his upbringing or childhood trauma, but is simply something he does because he wants to. That he goes on to explain that he was born into a wealthy family. He excelled in school, achieved a lot of success, but he found life ungratifying despite having all the money that he could ask for. And the only thing that brought his life any meaning was the adrenaline rush of high-stakes gambling. But after losing all of his money in a card game to the Penguin and left destitute, he decides to escape from his meaningless existence by jumping off of a bridge. And so while he's contemplating this, he's approached by a man brandishing a knife who demands that Zsasz hand over his watch and his cufflinks. Now, Zsasz is able to disarm this guy, and once the knife is in his hands, he kills the mugger and basically wakes up this motivation to continue his life so he can free others from their lives, almost like the character of Jigsaw from the Saw films. Now, this is also when he starts tracking his kills with cuts on his skin, and to that point in his life, he had tallied 143 victims with the hope of adding as many more as he could. And so to Zsasz, people are no better than robots or zombies, that they're all basically mindless and insignificant, and to end their life is to do them a favor by releasing them from that curse. And after hearing this explanation, the psychiatrist is horrified and asks Zsasz a follow-up question, which he basically whispers the answer. And when the doctor moves closer to hear his response, Zsasz grabs her through the bars of his cell, and it's basically implied that he kills her, although it's not really shown on panel. But after his introduction and his origin, he occasionally shows up in Batman stories, but is most typically relegated to expansive crossover stories that feature multiple villains where he basically plays a relatively minor role. A good example of this is during the Nightfall storyline, which most of you guys know is the story where Bane originally broke Batman's back. Zsasz does make an appearance in Batman 493 where he, along with several other inmates, had all basically broken out of Arkham Asylum. Batman pursues Zsasz after learning that he's taken the students of the Bates School for Women hostage, and while he holds the girls at gunpoint, he warns the police not to send anyone after him, and so of course the cops do, and Zsasz promptly slits the officer's throat and adds a line to his kills tallied on his body. And then Zsasz vows to start killing off the students and then takes Officer Renee Montoya captive. So when Batman arrives, Zsasz tries to get in Batman's head by telling him that the two of them are essentially the same. They both crave the power of instilling fear in other people. Of course, Batman and Zsasz fight, which ends with Batman mercilessly beating this guy nearly to death before being stopped by Montoya. And after Zsasz had been returned to custody, Batman actually sits alone on a rooftop, horrified by the fact that he nearly snapped and killed a guy. Now, the next time we see Victor is during the No Man's Land event in Batman Chronicles number 18, where he's a patient of the field hospital of Dr. Leslie Tompkins after Gotham had been abandoned by the government and law enforcement and has basically been divided up into various sectors, each under the control of a different villain. And so Zsasz has seemingly added a significant number of people to his kill count, and when we see him, he's unconscious and strapped to a park bench. But even in this position, he manages to cut the artery of one of the orderlies that's watching over him, and as Batman arrives with blood for transfusions, he's pissed off to no end when he finds out that Tompkins is treating Zsasz and that she intends to use the blood that he's brought to save Zaz's life. And so Batman leaves when Tompkins refuses to stop treating Zsasz, and then once Victor comes to, he threatens to kill Dr. Tompkins. Of course, she tries to reason with him, but just when it looks like Victor is about to kill her, Killer Croc attacks Zsasz in retaliation for mortally wounding one of his friends. Of course, Batman returns, incapacitates Victor, and then vows to return him to prison. But following that, Victor Zsasz turns up in Detective Comics 796 in 2004. This time, he tries to kill Stephanie Brown, who some of you guys may know was operating as Batman's Robin at the time. Now, Batman does rescue Stephanie, and in the ensuing fight, Stephanie punches Victor in the nose, which allows Batman to incapacitate the guy. But after the fight, Batman loses it on Stephanie for using deadly force, and basically explaining that if Zaz's nose had not already been broken, the cartilage would have splintered into his brain and killed him. And this would prove to be one of the incidents that led to Batman firing Stephanie Brown. But after that, he shows up in a significant capacity in a 2006 story that was called Victims in Detective Comics 815. In this issue, one of the doctors at Arkham drops a pin, and then Zsasz manages to grab it and kill all the guards that are escorting him back to his cell, which allows him to escape. Once he's out, he goes after Alfred Pennyworth at a charity event, stabbing him and then critically injuring Alfred. Now, of course, believing that Alfred's dead, Zsasz carves another mark into his skin. But when Bruce Wayne goes on television to announce that Alfred's recovering at the hospital, Zsasz realizes his tally's off and then vows to finish the job. So just as Batman planned, Victor goes to the hospital, but of course, Batman stops him and sends him back to Arkham. But in 2008, DC hired film director Kevin Smith to write a 3-issue miniseries called Batman Cacophony. And this one was particularly important in relation to how Batman saw Victor, because in the first issue of the miniseries, Batman apprehends Victor Zsasz after he's killed 2 people, but before he can get to their children. And so in the struggle to subdue him, Batman remarks that of all the lunatics that he spends his life putting down, Victor Zsasz is the one he hates the most. But in 2008, DC published the Final Crisis event, which basically saw the apparent death of Batman, which led into a story called Battle for the Cowl. Just so you guys know, most of you guys probably do know, Batman wasn't dead. It just turned out he was time displaced. The justification for that was the fact that Batman's just too popular to kill, right? So DC couldn't get rid of him permanently. But Battle for the Cowl basically answered the question of who would fill Batman's shoes now that Bruce Wayne was believed to have been dead. Eventually, Dick Grayson does become the new Batman, and during this time, In addition to the regular monthly books of Batman and Detective Comics, DC decided to launch Batman Streets of Gotham as a monthly series to basically give readers a street-level view of Batman from the perspective of other characters. And one of the main characters in the series was the villain Black Mask, who's nearly killed by Damian Wayne, who's serving as the Robin to Dick Grayson's Batman. Zsasz, however, saves Black Mask, and as a reward, he's given all the money he needs to live out his dreams. And as you guys can probably imagine by now, this guy's got some pretty sadistic dreams, and he uses the money to buy an abandoned warehouse and turn it into a fight club for kidnapped orphan children, so they can basically fight one another until only one was left standing. Now, once one child had emerged victorious, they would be given the opportunity to gain their freedom by fighting Zsasz himself. Now, obviously, none of the kids can beat a fully grown man, so he actually ends up killing several of the kids along the way. But Damian Wayne finds out about this and wrestles with the idea that Bruce and Dick continually let Zsasz live, which led to the deaths of dozens or maybe even hundreds of victims. And so Damian is still tempted to kill Zsasz, but respects the orders of Batman and Dick Grayson, the people who came before him, and intentionally misses Zsasz's spine by stabbing him and then subsequently throws him in the harbor. Of course, Zsasz somehow manages to not drown, but is clearly apprehended because the next time we see him, he's back in Arkham Asylum. Now, following this, he just kind of makes sporadic appearances in DC Comics. He doesn't really do much of note. He has recently appeared in the 2025 Two-Face series, which actually sees Harvey Dent taking on an attorney role in a court called the White Church, which is run by the underworld of Gotham. But Dent's first client that we actually see him represent is Victor Zsasz, who's accused of murdering a lieutenant of the Marconi crime family. Now, Zsasz does plead innocence, claiming that he commemorates every single one of his victims with a tally mark on his skin, and insisting that the last victim that he killed was a kindergarten teacher. And so there's no way that he could be the killer of the Marconi lieutenants, since there's no mark for him. Not only that, he always makes a similar mark on his victims, tying them together in some sense of morbid marriage in his mind. And since the lieutenant does not have a mark like that, there's no way that Victor Zsasz could be the killer. Now, following this, chaos erupts throughout the courtroom, and Zsasz slices the face of one of the Marconis and then holds a woman at knife point before escaping in the chaos after Two-Face convinces him to leave with his innocence proven. But as the book ends, we actually see Zsasz outside the home of the same woman communicating with the voice of his last victim in his mind. So it kind of clears the air to a degree on his character and shows that he really is sadistic, but more so than that, he's absolutely insane. So yeah, that's Victor Zsasz, man. This guy is so screwed up. And honestly, I'm kind of terrified to know what this guy's body count actually is. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.